If a man stood before you and claimed he had face-to-face conversations with Jesus, predicted the events of 9/11, and held the title of a living apostle, you might expect his daily life to reflect a deep devotion to the poor and needy. Instead, behind closed doors, this self-proclaimed prophet was running a sprawling network of multi-state call centers that operated less like a traditional church and more like an authoritarian corporation. While the public saw a charismatic leader broadcasting messages of hope and dream interpretation, the people answering the phones were living under a strict regime where they were denied food, forbidden from speaking privately to their own spouses, and threatened with eternal damnation if they missed their daily financial targets. The contrast between the heavenly promises and the earthly nightmare seemed impossible to bridge, until federal investigators began quietly pulling on a single thread. Just a quick heads up before the story begins. Every single name, location, and piece of evidence you're about to hear is completely real, taken directly from public federal court transcripts and official police records. None of the details have been fictionalized or altered for drama. Because of the serious nature of these real-world events, viewer discretion is advised as we walk through the exact steps of the case. The investigation into what federal authorities described as a nationwide human trafficking and forced labor network disguised as a multi-state ministry began quietly, long before the public raids exposed its scale. The initial clues came to the attention of federal investigators through a series of leads concerning an organization known as the Kingdom of God Global Church, which previously operated under the name Joshua Media Ministries International. Founded by a self-professed religious leader named David E. Taylor, then 53, and managed alongside the church's executive director, Michelle Brannon, then 56, the organization maintained its central base of operations in the city of Taylor, Michigan. For years, the public face of the ministry consisted of television commercials, digital media campaigns, and religious services centered around Taylor's claims of divine authority. Taylor marketed himself not merely as a pastor or a preacher, but as an apostle. He told his followers that he maintained a unique relationship with the divine, claiming he was God's second-in-command and frequently had direct, face-to-face conversations with Jesus. Furthermore, he claimed the ability to predict major global catastrophes, including the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Using these supernatural claims as a foundation, Taylor and Brannon built a massive financial apparatus driven by multi-state call centers that specialized in offering phone prayers and a service called dream interpretation, where operators would analyze a caller's dreams in exchange for financial donations. The first significant breach in the organization's wall of secrecy occurred when individuals managed to escape the church's properties and make contact with law enforcement. Special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and financial auditors from the Internal Revenue Service began coordinating on a joint investigation. By reviewing financial records, tax documents, and public complaints, investigators noticed a stark contradiction between the nonprofit, charitable status of the church and the actual flow of money. Over a 12-year period beginning in April 2013, the organization managed to solicit approximately $50 million in donations. As the FBI and the IRS dug deeper into the operation, they utilized targeted investigative tactics, including the interception of communications and interviews with former members who had managed to break away from the group. The evidence collected began to reveal that the call centers, located not only in Taylor, Michigan, but also across St. Louis, Missouri, Houston, Texas, and Ocala, Florida, were being operated entirely by unpaid labor. The workers were church members who had been systematically coerced into giving up their outside employment, their personal assets, and their freedom. The turning point in the investigation came when law enforcement gathered enough actionable evidence to secure federal indictments and search warrants. In August 2025, federal prosecutors unsealed a 10-count indictment in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan, charging both David E. Taylor and Michelle Brannon with conspiracy to commit forced labor, substantive forced labor, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Immediately following the unsealing of the indictment, a coordinated multi-state tactical operation was launched by federal agents, assisted by local law enforcement units, including the Marion County Sheriff's Office SWAT team in Florida. The execution of the search warrants provided physical proof of the conditions described by the victims. When federal agents raided an $8 million, 10-bedroom mansion used by the ministry, they discovered dozens of church workers living in highly restrictive, communal conditions. At one location, more than 12 workers were forced to inhabit a single, confined living quarter located directly above a garage, all sharing one bathroom. Investigators also discovered that children were present and being utilized within the call center properties. During the physical search of the properties, agents seized computers, hard drives, and financial ledgers. They discovered thousands of explicit photographs and videos involving female workers within the ministry, which added an entirely new layer of exploitation to the evidentiary pool. Forensic financial analysis conducted by the IRS played a critical role in establishing the motive for the forced labor conspiracy. By tracking the $50 million in incoming public donations, investigators proved that the funds were never used for the public charity projects advertised by the church. Taylor and Brannon had routinely instructed their call center staff to tell donors that their money would fund humanitarian efforts, such as drilling clean water wells for impoverished communities or providing direct support to victims of human trafficking. Instead, the bank records showed the money was funneling directly into private accounts to support an incredibly lavish lifestyle for the two leaders. The financial forensic trail documented millions of dollars spent on high-end real estate, domestic and international airline tickets, and an extensive fleet of luxury vehicles. Investigators seized several Mercedes-Benz models, Bentleys, and a high-end, customized Rolls-Royce. The funds were also used to purchase recreational vehicles, including all-terrain vehicles, jet skis, and a private boat. Even everyday church funds were diverted toward personal indulgences. Financial records detailed thousands of dollars from the donation pool being spent on high-end luxury food items, including a single purchase of 125 pounds of king crab legs for the leader's private consumption. To maintain the continuous stream of revenue required to fund these purchases, Taylor and Brannon relied on a highly structured system of psychological and physical coercion. The investigation revealed that workers were recruited under the false promise of spiritual fulfillment and eternal salvation. However, once individuals committed to the ministry full-time, the leadership systematically stripped away their autonomy. Workers were forced to work extreme shifts, sometimes exceeding 20 hours a day, without any financial compensation. The indictment noted that Taylor set entirely unobtainable daily and weekly monetary donation goals for the staff. The internal operations resembled an authoritarian cult. Members were completely isolated from the outside world. Taylor and Brannon ordered workers to sever all ties with family members, friends, or anyone who questioned the operations of the church. The daily lives of the staff were entirely managed by the defendants. Leadership controlled where the workers slept, what they were permitted to eat, what clothes they wore, how they were allowed to speak to one another, and when they were permitted to use the restroom. Even married couples who worked within the ministry were forbidden from having private conversations with one another without explicit authorization. The investigation also brought to light a group of workers known within the church as armor bearers. These individuals functioned essentially as unpaid, around-the-clock personal servants for David Taylor. One specific assistant, identified in historical accounts of the ministry's operations, uprooted his family to serve Taylor without a paycheck, spending his days cooking, cleaning, maintaining Taylor's real estate properties, and washing his luxury vehicles. Furthermore, these personal servants were required to transport a rotating group of women to and from Taylor's various residences. The servants were then ordered to ensure that these women took emergency contraception, specifically Plan B, to prevent any potential pregnancies that could disrupt the image of the ministry. When donations naturally began to decline, the pressure on the unpaid workforce intensified. If workers failed to hit their daily financial goals, complained about the hours, or attempted to walk away from the property, they were subjected to severe punishments administered primarily by Michelle Brannon. The tactics used to maintain control included intense public humiliation, where a worker would be screamed at and insulted with racial slurs in front of the entire congregation. Workers were routinely subjected to sleep deprivation, restricted access to food, and physical assaults. In several documented instances, Brannon threw buckets of ice water on sleeping workers to wake them up for extra shifts. The primary tool for compliance, however, remained psychological and spiritual abuse. Taylor and Brannon continuously threatened the workers with divine judgment, telling them that any failure to meet financial goals or any act of disobedience toward Taylor was a direct sin against God. Workers were told that if they defected or slackened in their duties, they would be struck down with severe, incurable physical illnesses, face immediate death, or spend eternity in hell. Due to this intense conditioning, many victims remained trapped in the cycle of abuse for years, genuinely believing that their suffering was required for their spiritual salvation. Following the coordinated arrests, the legal process moved into the federal court system. David E. Taylor was taken into custody in Durham, North Carolina, while Michelle Brannon was arrested by federal agents in Tampa, Florida. Because the core conspiracy was centered around the original church facilities in Michigan, Brannon was subsequently extradited back to the Eastern District of Michigan to face her arraignment. During the initial court proceedings in late September and early October 2025, intense legal battles occurred regarding pretrial detention and bail conditions. Federal prosecutors argued aggressively that Brannon should be held without bond, presenting evidence to the judge that she posed a significant flight risk due to her access to vast, unexplained sources of church funding. The prosecution also argued that she posed a direct danger to the community, citing her reign of terror over the victims and the high probability that she would attempt to intimidate current or former church members into changing their stories before a trial could take place. The defense countered by emphasizing that Brannon had no prior criminal record and was currently in poor health, noting that she had experienced a medical episode described as a heart attack while initially held in custody in Florida. The federal judge overseeing the bond hearing acknowledged that the prosecution's evidence painted a picture of an organization that functioned far more like a destructive cult than a traditional church. However, the court ruled that the prosecution had not met the specific legal threshold required to prove that Brannon was an immediate physical danger to the public. The judge granted Brannon release on a $10,000 unsecured bond subject to incredibly strict pretrial conditions. She was placed under total home incarceration in Northville, Michigan, and required to wear a continuous GPS monitoring device. The court ordered a complete ban on any contact, either direct or indirect, with any member or former member of the Kingdom of God Global Church. Additionally, because the apartment she intended to use for her home confinement was actively being leased by active church members, the judge gave her a strict 30-day deadline to secure alternative housing funded entirely by individuals outside of the ministry. She was also forced to surrender her United States passport to prevent her from leaving the country. Each of the federal charges leveled against Taylor and Brannon, conspiracy to commit forced labor, and conspiracy to commit money laundering, carries a maximum statutory penalty of 20 years in federal prison. Because the indictment lists multiple counts and multiple distinct victims, both defendants face a total exposure of more than 60 years in prison, alongside federal fines exceeding $1 million each if convicted at trial. Despite the high-profile federal arrests, the unsealing of the detailed indictments, and the ongoing court proceedings, the institutional infrastructure of the Kingdom of God Global Church did not instantly dissolve. Because a formal conviction has not yet been handed down by a jury, the legal status of the organization allows it to remain active. The ministry continues to maintain an online presence, broadcast its messaging, and actively solicit financial donations from the public, even as its top leadership awaits a federal trial that will determine the final outcome of the decade-long investigation.